2 weeks after the wedding, while grabbing my jacket, I heard her whisper, "He really thinks I married him for love." Then a man's voice answered, "Good. Keep it that way." I stepped outside before she. I used to think I was careful about who I let close. Years of running an architecture firm taught me to read faces, measure words, sense the cracks beneath polite smiles. But marriage blinds you in a way business never could. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was still living in that soft illusion that love meant safety. That morning destroyed it. It was late. I'd overslept, rushing to grab my jacket before heading to a client meeting. Vanessa's perfume hung in the hallway, sweet and expensive, the kind that leaves a trail rather than a scent. I bent to pick up the jacket when I heard her voice from the living room. Low, intimate, the kind of tone people use when they believe they're unseen. She said it almost lazily, as if it were a joke, that I really thought she married me for love. And then another voice, male, deep, confident, replied that she should keep it that way. For a second, I froze. The air thickened. I couldn't even process the words. They sounded like fragments from a bad dream. I didn't barge in, didn't shout. I just stepped outside, closed the door quietly, and stood in the driveway staring at my reflection in the car window. The reflection looked composed, but something underneath had cracked. The drive to the office felt mechanical. Every turn, every red light replayed that sentence in my head. When I arrived, I couldn't even remember the route I'd taken. The meeting blurred by blueprints, figures, hollow laughter. My partner Julian did most of the talking, which suited me fine. He was the charismatic one, the face of our firm. People liked him because he seemed effortless, and I'd once trusted that ease completely. When I came home that evening, Vanessa was radiant. She greeted me like nothing had happened, asked about my day, poured me wine, talked about booking a trip to Lake Tahoe. Her phone buzzed twice, and she turned it face down, smiling in that distracted way that made something coil tighter inside my chest. After dinner, I excused myself and went to our bedroom. Her handbag was on the chair. It wasn't guilt that made me look, it was instinct. Inside, between receipts and lipstick, was another phone. Not her usual one. It had a cracked corner and no case. There were no notifications, no wallpaper, just a string of recent calls. One number repeated 3 times. Julian. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at that name until the screen dimmed. My first reaction wasn't rage, it was calculation. Years of managing contracts, and people had trained me to pause before action. If she was lying, I needed to know why. If Julian was involved, it wasn't only personal, it was professional. When Vanessa walked in, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired and wanted to sleep early. She leaned over, kissed my cheek, and said she loved me. Her voice was smooth, but it hit me wrong, like hearing a familiar song played slightly off-key. Over the next few days, I watched her patterns change. She started leaving early for errands, taking long showers with her phone on the counter, keeping her laptop closed the moment I entered the room. I pretended not to notice. I even took her out to dinner twice, and each time she played her part perfectly, smiling, touching my arm, laughing too hard at nothing. Meanwhile, Julian grew distant at the office. Meetings that used to flow smoothly now had tension beneath them. He kept deflecting questions about our latest contract with the development group. Said he'd handle the paperwork later. I trusted him with numbers, so I hadn't checked the balance sheets in detail for weeks. That changed. One evening, I stayed late and went through our recent transactions. A new account name appeared, listed as a temporary holding for project funds. $500,000 we were supposed to transfer to a materials supplier. The signature authorizing it matched both of ours. Only I never signed that document. The initials beside mine were forged. I remember staring at it, the fluorescent office light buzzing faintly, until the room began to feel small. My partner and my wife, both tied to my business, both acting strange. The memory of her whisper echoed again, colder now. The next morning, I decided to test something. I casually asked Vanessa if she wanted to visit the construction site Julian and I had been managing. Her reaction was subtle but sharp, a hesitation before agreeing. When I told Julian about it, he immediately claimed the site wasn't ready for guests. Too messy, too dangerous. Both of them gave me the same excuse in different words. That night, I checked the hotel transaction again. It wasn't just a dinner reservation. It was a weekend booking for 2 under a corporate discount. The address was downtown, close to where Julian lived. I didn't confront her yet. I wanted evidence, not emotion. But restraint has its limits. One afternoon, while Vanessa was showering, her phone rang. The caller ID said, "Property Manager." The name sounded harmless, so I answered. The voice on the other end asked if Mr. and Mrs. Hale still wanted the penthouse furnished by next week. I said they did, then hung up. There was no penthouse in our name, no reason for her to be involved with any property deal. The number, when traced later, belonged to a real estate broker Julian had used before. I realized then that this wasn't just an affair. Something larger was being arranged behind my back. The next day, I attended a client dinner with both of them present. Julian was smooth as always, charming investors, telling jokes. Vanessa sat beside me, resting her hand lightly on my arm, the perfect supportive spouse. But when their eyes met, just once, across the table, it was unmistakable. A brief flicker of understanding, too controlled to be guilt, too precise to be coincidence. I left before dessert, claiming a headache. She came home an hour later, smelling faintly of Julian's cologne. She probably didn't even notice. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan hummed quietly above me as I lay awake replaying every moment of the past year. How she'd met Julian at one of our firm's events, how she'd insisted we invite him to the wedding, how she'd encouraged me to trust him more. It wasn't just betrayal, it was orchestration. In the early hours, I went into my study and started collecting everything: copies of financial statements, digital backups, photos, and emails. I saved them all in an encrypted drive under a harmless project name. If they wanted to play smart, I'd play smarter. When morning came, she greeted me with coffee and asked if I'd slept well. I told her I had. She smiled and said she was meeting an old friend for lunch. I wished her a good day and watched her car pull out of the driveway. Then I followed. She didn't go to any restaurant I recognized. Instead, she parked outside a law office downtown. The sign on the door made my stomach turn: corporate and marital law specialists. She walked in carrying a slim envelope. I waited 15 minutes, then left before she could see me. That night, she acted perfectly normal again. But I already knew. The whisper I'd heard 2 weeks after the wedding had been more than a careless confession. It was the opening line of a plan carefully built before I ever said, "I do." And I wasn't going to interrupt it yet. Not until I could make sure both of them paid for underestimating me. For the next few days, I became an expert at pretending. Pretending to sleep, to laugh, to listen, to care. Pretending not to notice that my wife had started carrying her phone everywhere, even to the bathroom. She would hum to herself when she cooked, but it was hollow. I could feel the walls tightening around something she didn't want me to see. I didn't act suspicious or cold. Instead, I leaned into normalcy. I brought home flowers, cooked dinner, suggested movie nights. The calmer I was, the safer she felt. And the safer she felt, the more careless she became. At work, Julian avoided eye contact whenever we crossed paths. He used to greet me with that overly confident grin that made investors believe everything he touched turned to gold. Now he barely nodded. He had an excuse for everything: meetings, calls, urgent opportunities. I let him have them. The more they acted, the clearer the pattern became. Vanessa was playing the devoted wife at home, while Julian was positioning himself as the indispensable partner at work. And somewhere between those two acts, my downfall was being written. One evening, after she left for another yoga class, I sat in my office at home and combed through our company's financial system again. It was like following the scent of smoke in a dark room. Faint, but unmistakable. Several invoices had been duplicated, and one account had been quietly rerouted to a new holding company registered under a generic name: VJ Holdings, LLC. I didn't need to guess what the initial stood for. It was brilliant in a disgusting way. They weren't stealing money outright. They were diverting investments, building a shadow structure beneath mine. If I confronted them too early, they'd spin it as confusion, maybe even paranoia. But if I let them finish, if I let them believe I was blind, I could expose them with precision. The next day, I called my old college friend, Cole, the one who'd been uneasy at my wedding. He wasn't just a friend. He was an accountant who now worked with forensic audits. I told him I needed quiet help reviewing some irregularities. I didn't mention Vanessa or Julian, just the facts. He came over that night with 2 laptops and a look that told me he already suspected something deeper. Together we dug into the records until past midnight. By morning, he confirmed what I feared, and more. Not only were company funds being funneled, but there was also a secondary insurance claim under my name. If the firm went bankrupt, I would be the one liable. Julian and Vanessa had ensured every legal tie pointed to me as the primary signer. It wasn't just betrayal now, it was entrapment. Cole asked if I was ready to confront them. I said not yet, because anger burns fast. Revenge needed to burn slow. That weekend, Vanessa insisted we visit her parents. I agreed. Her father had always admired me, said I brought stability into her life. Over lunch, Vanessa played the role of perfect wife flawlessly. She talked about our future, about building a family, about taking a trip to Europe. I nodded and smiled, wondering if her father noticed how she avoided my eyes. On the way back, she leaned her head on my shoulder and said how happy she was that I trusted her completely. The irony almost made me laugh. A few days later, Julian hosted a dinner for the firm's investors. It was supposed to be a showcase for our new project, but I could tell it was a test, a performance to prove that I was either irrelevant or unstable. Vanessa came along, of course, dressed in a black dress that could make anyone forget the world around her. She moved through the room like she owned it. Maybe she believed she did. Halfway through the evening, Julian made a small announcement about restructuring leadership to reflect recent growth. His tone was careful, diplomatic, but every word was crafted to suggest I was stepping back voluntarily. A few investors nodded approvingly. Vanessa clapped the loudest. I smiled, even raised my glass. But I watched them both carefully, her pride, his arrogance, and understood something important. They believed the plan was working. When we returned home that night, she was radiant. She poured wine, turned on music, and said how proud she was of me for being adaptable. That word lingered. Adaptable, as if I were something she'd shaped to fit her convenience. She danced briefly in the living room, laughing when I didn't join. I excused myself and went to the office upstairs. I could hear her singing faintly through the walls, unaware that downstairs her husband was dismantling her world one keystroke at a time. I'd already begun transferring sensitive files and patents under a private holding company I'd created months earlier, long before our marriage. I restructured ownership quietly, sending the new documentation through Cole for safekeeping. The beauty of architecture lies in its structure, and mine had layers they hadn't even considered. The next morning, Vanessa mentioned she was meeting a lawyer friend for lunch again. I nodded. She looked almost disappointed that I didn't ask questions. That confirmed she was testing boundaries. Instead of going to the office, I tailed her car again, but this time from farther back. She parked near the same law office, but didn't go inside immediately. Julian was already waiting in the cafe across the street. They sat close, heads tilted, voices low. They weren't flirting this time. They were planning. She passed him a folder, and he signed something inside. I didn't need to hear the words to know what they were finalizing. They were preparing documents that would make her part owner of my firm through marital entitlement. She didn't need to steal. The law would hand her everything. I left before she noticed me. That evening, while she showered, I checked her computer. I'd avoided doing that before, but hesitation had no place anymore. Her email confirmed my suspicion. Messages exchanged with Julian about timelines, shares, and moving fast before he changes anything. There was even a draft addressed to a financial advisor about transferring her portion of equity post-approval. I forwarded everything to Cole and wiped the traces. Then I sat there, staring at the monitor glow, realizing something that chilled me more than anger ever could. This wasn't an impulsive affair. It was methodical, pre-planned. The wedding hadn't been a celebration of love. It had been a transaction. Later that night, Vanessa came to bed and asked if I was awake. I pretended to stir, and she whispered something about how lucky she felt to have me. Her fingers brushed my arm, warm and practiced. I wondered if she rehearsed those gestures in the mirror before coming to bed. I said nothing. The next few days, I moved quietly. I contacted a private auditor through Cole and arranged for them to review the firm under confidentiality. Meanwhile, I told Julian I wanted to schedule a strategy meeting with all stakeholders in 2 weeks. He looked nervous but agreed quickly, eager to finalize whatever he was hiding before then. Vanessa started growing bolder too. She began talking about buying a new car, redecorating the house, even upgrading our insurance policies. She was preparing for a future she believed she owned. One night, while she was on the phone in the backyard, I stood near the window and listened through the glass. Her tone was low but animated, the same one she'd used that morning 2 weeks after our wedding. I caught fragments. He has no idea. Almost done. After the review, I went back to my desk and opened a new folder labeled Closure. Inside it, I placed everything I'd gathered, her emails, photos, forged documents, financial logs. It was growing thicker each night. Vanessa came in, still glowing from the conversation, kissed me goodnight, and went upstairs humming softly. She thought the stage was almost ready. She didn't know I'd already built the trap she'd walk into first. The following week felt like living inside a rigged game where every move I made was already predicted by someone else. But the beauty of building structures, whether made of glass or deceit, is that every flaw can be exploited. And I'd started to see theirs. Vanessa was growing too confident. That was her mistake. Confidence makes people sloppy. She began wearing new clothes, making impulsive purchases, and talking about our future in a tone that hinted at ownership. She was rehearsing life without me even realizing I'd already stepped out of the script she'd written. At the firm, Julian started pushing for deadlines and quick sign-offs. He claimed the investors were impatient. In reality, he was consolidating authority before the audit I'd quietly arranged through Cole reached completion. The man was smart, but like Vanessa, he believed I was slow to act, too trusting, too sentimental. The kind of person who notices betrayal only when it's too late. They both underestimated how calm fury can be. I spent my evenings finalizing my own insurance policies, transferring minor assets, and updating passwords across every platform. Vanessa thought she was building a foundation to take half my life. She didn't realize I'd already removed the floorboards beneath her. I'd stopped trying to understand why she did it. Greed doesn't need philosophy. It's simple arithmetic. She added Julian's ambition to my stability and calculated her profit. Maybe she thought I'd forgive her even after losing everything. Maybe she just assumed I wouldn't fight back because I wasn't the type to shout or break things. But silence can be deadlier than rage. 3 days before the scheduled board meeting, I found a new document in our shared printer tray, a legal notice draft. The header read, Notice of Executive Transition. It outlined that I would step down due to health and stress-related challenges. My name was typed neatly above a forged signature. Julian and Vanessa had even arranged the narrative of my downfall. A burnt-out founder, handing over his creation to his capable successors. That evening, I came home early. Vanessa was in the kitchen on the phone, speaking softly. I couldn't hear the words, but her tone was sweet and performative, the same one she used on investors when she attended events as my wife. I walked in casually, startling her. She smiled quickly and said it was her mother. I nodded and kissed her forehead. She relaxed, not realizing that every word, every movement, only confirmed what I already knew. Later that night, I sent Cole the fake resignation notice and told him to prepare for impact. He replied with one sentence, "You have one shot." Time it perfectly. The next morning, Julian texted me suggesting we meet before the board review, said we needed to align messaging. His choice of words was ironic. He'd spent weeks aligning my destruction behind closed doors, and now he wanted to make sure I delivered my lines on cue. I agreed. We met at a downtown bar, a place we'd gone to for years after closing big deals. It almost felt nostalgic, two men sharing whiskey, pretending nothing was broken. He asked about my health, my stress, my marriage. He mentioned Vanessa in a way that sounded rehearsed, like a man talking about a colleague's wife he barely knew. I recognized the performance and played along. Then I mentioned the audit. His face barely twitched, but the silence that followed was loud enough. I told him it was routine, investor request. He nodded slowly, smiled, said it was good housekeeping. But I saw the faint tremor in his hand as he raised the glass. When I left, I knew I'd won half the battle. Julian's confidence cracked easily once uncertainty entered the room. He thrived on control. Doubt was his poison. That night, Vanessa poured wine for both of us and sat close. She looked radiant, almost euphoric. She said things like how she felt we were finally settled, that she could see our future clearer than ever. I nodded, smiled, and raised the glass. She didn't know that I'd already shared copies of her lawyer meetings with the private investigator Cole had hired. I didn't need to accuse her. The evidence was already moving faster than her lies. By the next morning, rumors had begun to circulate in the firm. A few senior partners hinted that I might be leaving. Julian fed that story like gasoline to fire, playing the part of the reluctant savior stepping up to maintain order. Vanessa spent her day comforting me, offering to help with paperwork, cooking my favorite dinner as if guilt had transformed into affection overnight. Every act she put on made it easier to stay detached. Then, the night before the board review, something unexpected happened. She came into my office after midnight, barefoot, wearing one of my shirts. She asked if we were okay, not in the casual way people do, but as if she was testing whether I'd caught on. There was a flicker of genuine nervousness in her eyes, the first real emotion I'd seen in weeks. Maybe she'd sensed the shift in me. I told her I loved her. She smiled, leaned down, kissed me softly, and whispered that everything would make sense soon. Then she left the room. It was the last night we'd ever share under the same roof. The next morning, I dressed early and arrived at the office before everyone else. The boardroom was polished to perfection, glass table gleaming, water bottles lined up, chairs symmetrical. Julian arrived with his signature grin, Vanessa at his side in a tailored navy dress, pretending she was there to support her husband. She placed her hand on my shoulder and wished me luck. The hypocrisy almost made me laugh. As the meeting began, Julian launched into his presentation, charts, projections, future strategies. He spoke with the passion of a man who already believed he'd won. Then, when he transitioned to the leadership adjustment proposal, he paused for dramatic effect. Everyone watched me. That was his moment, my supposed resignation. But before he could continue, I opened my briefcase and slid a small drive across the table. I asked the board to review its contents. The assistant plugged it in. The projector flickered to life, revealing emails, timestamped messages, and audio recordings. Julian's voice, Vanessa's voice, and the lawyer's voice discussing forged signatures, corporate transfer, and staged ownership clauses. Every detail, every line, dated, verified, undeniable. The room went silent. Julian's face drained of color. Vanessa froze, her hand halfway to her glass. I leaned back in my chair, calm and steady, and simply watched. Then came the second wave, the private auditor's report, confirming asset diversion and falsified transactions. Cole had timed it perfectly. It hit the board's inbox at that exact moment, a formal document attached with a request for investigation. Within 10 minutes, Julian was stammering about misunderstandings and miscommunications. Vanessa tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Her composure was gone. The perfect posture, the rehearsed calm, gone. One of the senior board members turned to me and said quietly, "We'll take it from here, Mr. Hale." I stood, collected my things, and walked out. As I passed Vanessa, she reached for my hand, whispering something I didn't bother to hear. Outside the room, the air felt lighter, sharper, almost electric. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. By that evening, Julian was suspended pending investigation. Vanessa's name was flagged in the firm's internal documents, her access revoked. She came home late, pale and trembling. She said nothing at first, just stood in the doorway, waiting for me to speak. I didn't. She finally muttered that she'd made a mistake, that Julian had promised it was temporary, that she only did it to protect us. Lies layered over panic. I simply told her the truth. She wasn't my wife anymore. That night, I moved out. The next day, I filed for annulment and submitted the evidence to the state's fraud division. They wanted to ruin my career. Instead, I turned their perfect plan into their confession. And it was only the beginning of what they'd lose. In the days that followed the board meeting, the silence around me felt strange. Not peaceful, just hollow. The kind of silence that comes after a building collapses and all that's left is the dust settling. For the first time in years, I had no one calling, no one asking for approvals or signatures, no Vanessa hovering with her soft manipulations. It was like the world had stepped back to watch what I'd do next. Julian vanished first. He didn't even show up to clear his office. Within 48 hours, the firm's lawyers discovered he had wired money to an offshore account under a fake subsidiary. They froze everything. The board reported him to the authorities, and the audit extended to his personal finances. It turned out he'd been quietly draining multiple clients through consulting fees that didn't exist. As for Vanessa, her fall wasn't instant. It was slow, humiliating, and public. The moment the investigation became official, the firm's legal department demanded all spousal signatures for verification. That meant her forged documents went straight to the state fraud division. Her lawyer, the same one she'd been visiting for weeks, denied any knowledge of criminal involvement and handed over copies of their correspondence. She'd used his firm's name without consent. She tried to come back home the second night after everything unraveled. Her car pulled into the driveway just before midnight. I saw the headlights through the blinds, but I didn't move. She stood at the door for several minutes, knocking softly, whispering my name, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Then she drove away. By morning, the story had leaked online. Architect's firm rocked by internal fraud investigation. Reporters called it a scandal involving corporate betrayal, insider theft, and a romantic connection. She didn't need to be named. Everyone who knew us connected the dots. I received a call from Cole that day. He told me Vanessa had been questioned by investigators. She admitted to signing documents she didn't fully understand, but the timestamps, the emails, the hotel meetings, all of it contradicted her. She was complicit, whether she'd signed for greed or love. Maybe both. When I read her official statement later, one line stuck with me. I was manipulated by both sides. Both sides. She'd spent weeks crafting a lie so perfect that even now, when cornered, she couldn't stop performing. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. There was no joy in watching the person you once trusted beg the same way they used to promise. A week later, I met with the investors privately. They wanted me to return as acting director. I accepted, but only temporarily. I didn't want to rebuild the same structure. Too much of it was poisoned. I focused instead on starting something smaller, clean, transparent, mine alone. By then, Vanessa's life had begun collapsing piece by piece. Her social circle evaporated overnight. Friends who'd once adored her stopped returning calls. Her family, embarrassed by the public shame, distanced themselves quietly. Her father tried reaching out to me once, apologizing for her mistakes. I told him I didn't hold grudges. I just didn't forget. 2 months later, she was formally charged as an accessory to corporate fraud and falsifying documents. Julian was already in custody by then, extradited after trying to flee through Canada. He faced multiple counts of embezzlement. When I read the case summary, it mentioned Vanessa had testified against him to reduce her sentence. That was the final proof of who she really was. She betrayed the man she'd betrayed me with. There was nothing left in her that resembled loyalty. I never attended the hearings. Cole kept me updated when necessary. He said the courtroom was packed with journalists and curious onlookers. She looked pale, thinner, nothing like the woman who used to fill a room with charm. The prosecutor presented the evidence I'd compiled, my recordings, the financial logs, her emails, and the jury didn't take long. She received 2 years, Julian 5. After the sentencing, she wrote me a letter from the detention center. It arrived in a plain white envelope, her handwriting still the same looping style she used on birthday cards. She said she regretted everything, that she didn't mean for it to go that far, that Julian had convinced her it was a business opportunity, not a betrayal. At the end, she added one line that made me pause. I did love you once. I didn't respond. Love wasn't supposed to feel like strategy. In the months that followed, I moved into a smaller apartment closer to downtown. I kept the firm, but let others handle the day-to-day operations. I spent most of my time designing again, something I hadn't done in years. Actual work, not politics. It felt honest. Cole remained my closest friend. One night, over drinks, he told me he'd always suspected Vanessa wasn't genuine. She looked at you like someone reading a map, he said, trying to find where the treasure was buried. He wasn't wrong. It took a while before the noise around the scandal faded. People eventually moved on. Clients returned. My name was cleared completely. The irony was that the very plan designed to destroy me had ended up rebuilding my reputation stronger than before. The board called me resilient. They didn't know it wasn't resilience. It was exhaustion turned into discipline. One afternoon, about a year after everything, I visited a small construction site on the edge of the city. It was a project I designed myself, something simple and clean, a public library. The structure was quiet, open, made entirely of glass and steel. Transparent. Honest. I like that word now. As I walked through the unfinished hall, sunlight poured through the open frames. It felt like standing inside something unburdened, something that didn't need secrets to stand upright. That night, as I locked my apartment, I found another letter slipped under the door. No return address, just my name. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The paper smelled faintly of the same perfume she used to wear, the scent that once filled every room of my house. I didn't read it. I dropped it straight into the trash. Because some structures aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some are better left in ruins, serving as a reminder of what happens when you ignore the cracks too long. And as I turned off the lights, I realized the truth that had taken me a year to understand. You can't stop people from being who they are, but you can make sure they never build anything on your foundation again.